First of all, thank you for being here this morning. I know that when the staff is gone and you don't know who's speaking, it's Victor who, the temptation to sleep in is great. When Stephen was making the announcements this morning, my mind flashed back. About a dozen years ago, I was scheduled to speak at this service, and the staff were away that weekend as well. And I was doing the whole service. I was standing at the back, and right at 10, somebody came running out of the office and gave me a piece of paper and said, "Here's an announcement that's not in the bulletin. Will you make it this morning?" Fortunately for me, I read it back there before I came up here to read it, because here's what it said, or here's what was written. Immediately after the sermon this morning, the parish nurses will be available to take your blood pressure. Yes, that really happened. Before I back into my talk this morning, I come to you with what I think is the finest Catholic joke you'll ever hear. A nun got out of bed one morning, left her room and made her way down the monastery hallway for morning prayer. She encountered another sister who looked at her, smiled, and said to the nun, My, it looks like you got up on the wrong side of the bed." The nun thought, well, that's odd, but kept going. She then bumped into another sister who looked at her, smiled, same thing. My, it looks like you got up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. The nun thought, okay, this is getting weird. And as she made her way to the chapel, it happened 15 times in a row. My, it looks like you got up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. 15th time, she thought it wasn't just odd and weird, it was now bullying for her community, and she was mad. Standing at the entrance to the chapel was the Mother Superior. And when the Mother Superior opened her mouth to say something, the nun exploded. She said, "Don't you dare say to me, I got up on the wrong side of the bed. Don't you dare." And the Mother Superior put her hands together and said, "Sister, I wasn't going to say any such thing. I was just going to ask, why are you wearing the bishop's slippers?" Let's back now into the sermon. I hope that was okay to tell in church. You never know. This is a Unitarian church, so it should be all right. I came across a blog online, high-profile blog. It was on mariashriver.com, and the title caught my eye because it said, "What does love look like?" And the author is a younger woman named Michelle Kennedy, no relation to the Kennedys, just Michelle Kennedy. And here's the backdrop for her question. What does love look like? She explains right in the opening paragraph that she had agreed to a second date with a man named Byron. And for the second date, Byron suggested that they hike through a canyon in Southern California where they lived. Michelle agreed readily because she said their first date was a most enjoyable dinner together, and she was looking forward to getting to know him better. So she said yes, without any hesitation. She explains, "I put on hiking pants, sandals, sunblocked my face, and met Byron at the canyon entrance, and we headed off." And she also says, "The romantic possibility swirled in the dust around my feet. It was a magical moment." Moment is the key word. Because about 30 seconds into the date, things began to deteriorate. When Byron suggested, instead of walking, they run the entire trail. Now, Michelle explained she is a jogger, except they'd agreed to hike and she wasn't dressed for a run. No sports bra, wearing sandals, and she thought that walking and talking would be an easier way to get acquainted, which makes sense. So, very gently, here's how the date deteriorated. "Michelle, I really didn't prepare to run, but how about keeping up a steady pace and chatting?" Byron, "I just like to get my heart rate up. It's really important to me." Michelle, "Okay, well, if you want to, go ahead, and I guess I'll just catch up to you." She said, hoping he would pick up on the hint, but he didn't. Byron took off, darting like a bee through the droves of people on the trail, made his way up the mountain, and disappeared. Michelle, I spent the next hour and a half walking by myself, mostly as my date zipped up and down the hills. All the while, I was wishing I had a parachute so I could float away from this man. And I kept hearing in my head, this is not what love looks like. Now, there's a PS to it. A couple of days later, Byron texted her, "Hey, Michelle, you're my new favorite person. I'm working on a project right now, but when I'm done, let's hang out." Michelle never texted back, wisely. Now, let's just go back to her question. What does love look like? I think sometimes we don't know. Obviously, love is very, very important because we humans think about it, talk about it, write about it, sing about it. Obviously, for many, there's not enough love in our lives, and there's not enough on the planet. That was the theme of that 1965 song that Stephen sang so beautifully, "What the World Needs Now." That's 1965. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing there's too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love, not just for some, but for everyone. But what does love look like, and how do you recognize it? So this morning, that's what I'd like to talk about. In fact, what I'd like to do is paint a picture of love using 4 simple sentences. So let's go through them one by one. What does love look like? First picture. Love has hands that help. Have you ever noticed how often in our English lexicon the word hands and helping go together? Just listen to some of the common phrases, and you probably use them. All hands on deck. Give a hand. You're in good hands. Get your hands dirty. Stretch out a helping hand. And one person who's combined the word hand and help very eloquently and with considerable wisdom is Kathleen Blanco. She's the former Democratic governor of Louisiana. Here's what she says: "My values aren't about pointing fingers. My values are about offering a helping hand." Big difference. Pointing fingers, helping hand. If you've ever seen or experienced hands helping, lifting, you will know that it is not just a memorable moment, but an inspiring moment. I read about a young man named Burt Friesen, F-R-I-Z-E-N. He was 19. He was in World War II, 1944, and he experienced the power of helping hands. Burt was a scout for his unit in the U.S. Army, and they had been making their way across Europe eastward toward Germany. The Germans at that time were in retreat. They encountered a lot of tank fire and bombing, and so they were hiding out in the woods, and then abruptly it stopped. So his unit made their way out of the woods to the edge of a field, a large field. They needed to get across. So Burt, being the scout, went out first. When he was halfway across on the field, suddenly on the other side, a whole German unit stood up and began firing machine guns. Several bullets smashed into Burt's legs, both of them. He collapsed to the ground while his colleagues ran back into the woods. He lay there for the longest time with bullets whizzing over his head, and then suddenly it became deathly quiet, and he was on his back, waiting for the worst. When it became so silent, he opened his eyes, and he could see a German soldier crawling across the field toward him. He closed his eyes a second time, waiting for the worst. After a few moments, when nothing happened, he opened one eye and peeked, and to his astonishment, the German soldier was kneeling by his side, smiling at him. And the German, without saying a word, picked Burt up in his arms, stood up, walked across the field, and took him to his American colleagues, placed him gently on the ground, and again, without saying a word, turned around and walked across the field. Both sides were deathly silent, and no one dared to fire a shot until the German was safe on his side, and then the war resumed. If Burt were here this morning and you asked him about World War II, what do you think would be the one thing he would mention immediately? The helping hands of that mysterious German soldier. So what does love look like? It has hands. Second word picture. What does love look like? It has feet that will move in the direction of the poor, the needy, the oppressed. Now, hear me out on this. Thoughts, we think about love, but thoughts are merely thoughts unless they're put into action. We feel things about love, but feelings are merely feelings unless they're put into action. And we talk about love, but words are merely words unless they're put into action. Love without action is nothing. The American novelist D.W. Howe may have had that in mind, and he said this very simple piece of advice. If a friend is in trouble, don't annoy him or her by asking if there's anything you can do. Think of something appropriate and do it. I have a curiosity question. Does anybody in this room know a man named Julius Goldwater? Okay, good. No. I discovered this man in the process of doing some research that I'm working on a book. Julius Goldwater was the first cousin and close cousin to a man you all do know probably, Senator Barry Goldwater, except that Julius, the life he lived and the values he exhibited are far more important than that of Senator Barry Goldwater. I need to tell you a little bit about Julius before I get to the point of why I'm bringing him to your attention. He was born in Los Angeles in 1908 to a prosperous Jewish family. Both his mother and his father were observant Jews and placed him in a pretty rigorous Jewish Sunday school program, but Goldwater later said it didn't take. And when his father took a position in Hawaii in the 1920s, Julius Goldwater encountered Buddhism. And it really resonated with him, and he became a Buddhist there. Senator Barry Goldwater and his side of the family always referred to Julius as eccentric. He really wasn't, except that in the 1920s, he was probably the first Jew in North America to become a Buddhist, and the first American to be ordained as a Shin Buddhist priest, which is what happened. He became a Buddhist in Hawaii, returned to Los Angeles, joined a Buddhist temple in the Little Tokyo section of Los Angeles, where they were so happy to have an American, they made him the youth minister. They felt he was such a strong role model that the priests at the temple pleaded with him to go to Japan and get full ordination, which he did. At his expense, he traveled to Japan, spent about a year there studying, and was ordained and returned to Los Angeles, where they gladly made him one of the priests at the temple at Little Tokyo. His life took a dramatic turn on December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese. That was December. 2 months later, in February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the arrest and incarceration of all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, more than 100,000 of them. They were put into camps, which President Roosevelt called concentration camps. Julius Goldwater suddenly found himself the priest of a temple with no members. It was a building this size. It had pews, and when he stood there Sunday morning after November, he was alone. The first thing he did, and he became in charge of several temples in the LA area, he took all of the temples and turned them into storage units so that Japanese Americans who were being incarcerated could safely store their belongings. Presumably, when they were released, they could come back and get them. And then, using his own money, Julius Goldwater traveled 4 times a year, once a quarter, to all of the concentration camps in the United States. And here's where it took him. He went to one in California, one in Arizona, one in Wyoming, one in Colorado, and believe it or not, there was one in Arkansas. That was his circuit. And when he went, he led services. He brought with him booklets that he wrote and self-published so that they would have study material. And he brought them, most importantly, news of the outside world. How's the war going? When's it going to end? Can we get home? When the war ended and Japanese Americans returned to California, it was Julius Goldwater who then turned the temples into hostels where they could live, because no one would rent to Japanese Americans and housing was in short supply. When families needed transportation, he loaned his car. When anti-Japanese grocers wouldn't sell them groceries, he went and bought them. Decades later, the Japanese Buddhist never forgot his compassion, and one man said, "We really admire this human being. We didn't have anyone else." And in 1990, when the U.S. government authorized reparation payments to Japanese Americans, one woman who received a small amount immediately took $500 of it and sent it to Julius Goldwater in 1991 with a note of thanks. Goldwater wrote back to her and said, "As long as I live, I won't cash it, but I accept it in the spirit that it was written." To do what he had to do, he was harassed by the FBI and government officials. He was called a Jap lover by Americans, and his home was vandalized many times. What does love look like? It has feet that hasten to the poor, the needy, and the oppressed. Third word picture. What does love look like? It has eyes that see suffering and respond. You know, some people look but never see. And I remember one time Henry David Thoreau wrote, "It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see." It's a story from the Jewish Bible that I want to tell you, and I think this will help us in terms of our relationships and identifying love and loving people. The story is not well known, but it ought to be. It concerns Abraham, who was, you know, the Abrahamic religions all come from Abraham. Judaism, Islam, Christianity. The biblical patriarch Abraham was an old man at the time of the story, and he has one more item on his bucket list, and it's his son Isaac. He's a young, handsome, capable guy, but he's unmarried. And so, as was the custom then, it's Abraham's job to find him a wife. And to do that, he's too old to travel. He calls his personal assistant the second in command. Abraham was a very wealthy, powerful individual. His second in command is a man named Eliezer. And he gives him this responsibility. He said, "I need you to make a journey," and he identifies a town. It would take him weeks to get there. He says, "Make this journey, and while you're on it, find a good wife for Isaac." Abraham provides no guidelines. He doesn't say the woman is to be gorgeous, that she's to be wealthy, come from a good family, be well-educated, nothing. Just find Isaac a good wife. So Eliezer loads up the camels, 10 of them. It's a long journey. And at every village that he stops at every oasis they stop at, Eliezer is watching women. Finally, when he approaches the city of Nahor, 2 or 3 weeks away, he encounters a woman who is carrying a jug of heavy water, and she's taking it back to her home. And because he's thirsty and because his water pouch is empty, he asks her, he said, "Would you mind filling my water pouch from your jug?" The woman agrees readily, and then noticing the 10 camels, she says, "I will also fetch water for your 10 camels." Now, this is not a simple task. I looked this up. One camel can drink 20 gallons of water. So there are 10 of them. She's got to bring about 200 gallons of water to feed these thirsty animals, and she does this without being asked to do it. Eliezer has found Isaac's wife. He asks for her father's name and permission to contact him. The woman's name is Rebecca. She becomes the second matriarch of Judaism, a very elevated and honored position, and she gains that because she is kind. She had eyes that saw the need of thirsty camels. So go back to Michelle Kennedy, the woman asking, what does love look like? She's looking for a romantic partner. The very first criteria that Michelle and anyone looking for a life partner should seek out is someone who is kind. Because if you are connected to someone who is kind, you will not suffer. Or at least you will not suffer as much. It also applies to our friendships. If in your closest circle you'll surround yourself with people who are kind, you won't suffer. Again, or at least not as much, because you've got good people around you. Fourth and last picture. What does love look like? It has ears to hear the sighs and sorrows of people. You know, how many times have we heard about someone's struggle, suffering, and sorrow, but really not done anything except feel badly? There always seems to be a gap, in my opinion, between intention and action. A gap. It's something that Martin Luther King Jr. addressed in his books, Strength to Love. I want you to hear his sentences because he's very eloquent. Martin Luther King Jr. One of the great tragedies of life is that people seldom bridge the gulf between practice and profession, between doing and saying. Here's the one I like. A persistent schizophrenia leaves so many of us tragically divided against ourselves. Love has ears to hear the sighs and sorrows of people and move in the direction of doing something. How many of you know the name Wayne Dyer? Oh, much better. You didn't know Julius Goldwater, but okay, Wayne Dyer. Best-selling author, motivational speaker, a great human being that this planet was blessed to have. He died about a year ago. But shortly before Wayne Dyer died, he was living in Hawaii. He was watching an HBO program, and I think most of us have probably seen it. It's a popular current events program called John Oliver Last Week Tonight. Anybody see it? He was watching it one evening when John Oliver profiled the plight of an elderly African-American woman named Harriet Cleveland, in her 60s, living on a small Social Security pension in Montgomery, Alabama, and raising her 3-year-old disabled grandson. Miss Cleveland received a traffic violation from the city of Montgomery for $75. She couldn't pay it. Now, she wasn't being irresponsible, but she took the ticket and put it on the edge of the table along with some other bills that she was struggling to keep up with, intending to pay what she could when some more money came in. The money didn't quite come in, and shame, shame, shame on the city of Montgomery, Alabama. They put interest on it and kept compounding it. And in no time, that $75 ticket accrued to $3,000. She was arrested in her home in front of her 3-year-old grandson, handcuffed in front of the little boy, and taken to jail to serve a 1-month term. Watching that story, Wayne Dyer did some internet research, found her address, the address of the jail. He sent Miss Cleveland $3,000 to cover the fine and get out of jail. And then a day later, he sent a second letter with another $2,000 for any additional expenses that she might have. Harriet, and she didn't know him, but she didn't know he was a best-selling author or he was an important person in our culture. She called him in tears, saying she couldn't believe that a complete stranger would send her more money than she'd ever had in her life. After Wayne Dyer died in August of 2015, his daughter Serena was asked by a magazine to share a memory of her father, and she cited Wayne's assistance to Harriet Cleveland, and here's what she said, and this is the kicker. She said probably millions of people watched that HBO program about Harriet Cleveland. Millions. But only one person reached out to help. It was my father. That's what I remember. She said, how many people watched Harriet, felt for her, talked about her, were saddened by her circumstances, but couldn't bridge the gap between intention and action? So, what does love look like? It has ears that hear, sighs, sorrows, suffering, and respond. The song written in 1965, What the World Needs Now is Love, Sweet Love, the only thing there's too little of, the song is true. Love looks like this: hands, feet, eyes, ears. Love looks like you, and you have it in your power to give the world what it needs. Thank you for hearing me out. Thank you.
We are your church, and we are proud to be your church, or at least a church that's having a positive impact on your life. I am personally blessed to be your minister, or at least a minister who you're allowing to speak into your life. I hope you'll support our ministry and share your love beyond belief by texting LOVEBB to 41444 or go to our website. But you can just text LOVEBB to 41444 and make your gift. It's wonderful. Thank you. Be blessed and be a blessing.